If you mean critical theory, if you mean things
Yes.
like deconstructionism, Marxism, queer theory, all of post-colonial theory, all of this, I never use any of that. What is most theory doing? Most theory, what it's doing is teaching the student to be feel superior to the author. For instance, some of my students, they read 2 poems by Wordsworth and they decide he's patriarchal and this and that and the other and start hitting him over the head. He lived for like over 80 years and wrote so much poetry. Have you read all of it? No. How are you in a position to judge whether he was patriarchal or not, and what does patriarchal even mean?
Older texts, how much of what we see is coming from us rather than the text?
Well, the basic, what you see, the basic is in the text. The basic things in the text. If you see stuff that is not in the text at all, as sometimes occasionally students do, if you just imagine your own stuff and put it into the text, that is misreading, according to me. You can't just read anything into any text. But of course, it's you who are reading the text, and so you will notice different things. Like, say, I must have read Hamlet, I don't know, 7,500 times. But each time with a great work, you notice something new. And that depends, it was already in the text, it's not you who are putting it there, but you notice something new. And that what you notice also partly depends on where you are, your age. What you see when you're 20 is different from what you see when you're 50. Say if you're reading King Lear, it's about the mistreatment of the older, that's one of its main themes. And when you haven't observed that closely and you certainly haven't experienced it at 20, you will see some of it, but there's things you might miss. And when you're older, then you've seen more, there may be much more that you realize when you're a parent yourself and so on. So there's that. And then, of course, it depends on how well you know the language. So there are certain words which have more than one meaning, and many words in every language have more than one meaning. And if it is the cause, my soul. Now, cause just means the reason to most people, and that's it. But it also has the meaning of this is the cause I'm fighting for. It has that meaning. It has many meanings. Not every reader will catch all the meanings, or every viewer, but depending on how much depth you have in the particular language, you will catch more of it or less of it. So a lot depends on that. And then if you're studying, if you're not just reading for pleasure or watching for pleasure, but you are studying it, you're rereading it, you're studying it, then you can look up some of these words and see their etymology and how they relate to words in other languages. And then you have a much more in-depth picture of what is going on. This is true of any text. I'm giving you examples from Shakespeare because his birthday is on the 23rd and I'm giving 2 plenary lectures on that. But I could give you examples from the Gita, which I also teach, or certainly from Urdu poetry. So the same applies to texts in different languages.
Shall we have some more examples from Gita, let's say?
In the Gita, for example, the sound of, I have taught the Gita and I teach it to American students. So I'm teaching it in translation. There's no perfect translation, but I'm teaching it in English translation. But that helps me to see the difference between the original and the translation, especially when the language into which you are translating, English, is only very distantly related. It is related, but very distantly related to Sanskrit. And so there's a lot of things you can't translate. For example, when the Gita mentions a deepak, a lamp, an oil lamp. Now, Indians all know what that is. But in English, when you say a lamp, the lamp flickers. The mind of a sage is like a lamp that does not flicker in the still air. Now, most modern kids, even Indians, but certainly Western kids, they would think of a table lamp. That doesn't flicker except when the voltage is flickering, and that you don't have in the West very much, right? So now I can explain the whole thing. This is what a lamp is. But okay, so they can understand it. It's not that they can't understand it, but it's not the immediate perception that most Indians would have who have seen a deepak and seen the lamp flickering in the breeze and all of that. It's just a minor example. And then there are sound effects. In any original poem, there are sound effects which cannot be reproduced in translation at all. And without that, you get the meaning. So prose, for instance, when you translate prose, a prose essay, you can get the entire meaning. Poetry depends for its effect, good poetry, not prose that's cut up into lines and called poetry as today, but good poetry depends for its effect largely on sound. It's music, basically, and that sound you cannot reproduce in translation. For example, when Krishna says to Arjuna, Uttishta, stand up. So you translate it as stand up. Stand up doesn't have the harsh consonants of Uttishta, which is, it tells you something. So you can get the meaning, the difference between sitting and standing, anyone can understand, but you can't get this sound effect. It's a very minor example. There are many, any poetry will have many of these examples. That's what you lose, yeah.
So, talking of that, so do modern critical frameworks, do they sometimes illuminate texts?
If you mean critical theory, if you mean things
Yes.
like deconstructionism, Marxism, queer theory, all of post-colonial theory, all of this, I never use any of that. I find it not just not helpful, but actually an obstruction. So what Foucault, Derrida, all these people, I find it both certainly for Indian literature, but even for Western literature. And why? Because instead of looking at the thing itself in its context, in its both its historical context and its universal context, you are bringing a framework from somewhere else and from in most cases from a much later time, and imposing it on a text that it doesn't fit at all. You take post-colonial theory and put it on a 19th century, let's say, Bengali text. It doesn't fit. That's not. So it's very convenient for students to some extent, because it's easy. You've got a formula, you just apply the formula, and whether the text fits it or not, you stretch the text. There's this Greek Procrustean bed thing where you stretch the body to fit the bed. That's what is done. You stretch the body, or you cut off part of it to fit the bed. Ignore whatever in the text doesn't fit your formula, and just fit whatever does. Now, I don't use theory at all in any of my work or my teaching, and nor do I ask students to read any of it. In fact, I don't read any of it. I've read enough to know what it is, and to know that it's completely, I disagree with much of it, and even what I don't disagree with is all of that jargon is entirely unnecessary. So I ask the students to read the primary source. And I'm talking about undergraduate students. But if you're talking about a PhD student, that's a different matter. They can read many things and decide. But for an undergraduate student, I find the pleasure of reading the text, and that's what literature is. If it doesn't give you pleasure, then according to me, and not just me, according to every thinker throughout the ages, if it doesn't give you pleasure, whether it's rasa in Indian theory or it's pleasure in Western theory, Western criticism, if it doesn't give you pleasure, then what is most theory doing? Most theory, what it's doing is teaching the student to feel superior to the author. For instance, some of my students, they read 2 poems by Wordsworth, and they decide he's patriarchal and this and that and the other, and start hitting him over the head. He lived for like over 80 years and wrote so much poetry. Have you read all of it? No. How are you in a position to judge whether he was patriarchal or not, and what does patriarchal even mean? So very often a woman author is saying pretty much the same thing as the male author is saying. And it's not about what is saying. Most people, there are very few new ideas in the world. It's about how it is said. And Wordsworth has a particular way of saying it, which is different from another poet, right? So that is what I'm interested in, and that is what students are interested in too, when you free them from these shackles of having to look through the lens of some theory or another. Just look through your own eyes and connect with the text and what it tells you about emotion, about life, about death, about everyday experience. If it doesn't tell you anything about that, then it's not great work.
So you're talking about that, and you said about text being imposed. Is there a reading of a text, it could be academic or popular, which you strongly disagreed with because it felt imposed rather than discovered?
Huge numbers. Okay, a good example. Okay, shall I give you a Shakespeare example again? Because in King Lear, it's about basically what we would now call ageism and mistreatment and abuse of the elderly, old people. So the father is 80 plus years, over 80, and he has three daughters, and the two older daughters mistreat him, take away all his property, and then ultimately fight with him and throw him out of the house into the storm, right? That's what the basic story is. But now, why did these daughters do that? Two of them do that. The third one is a very loving daughter who rescues him and nurses him back from insanity. He goes mad and she nurses him back. So now, why did the two daughters do that? So we have any number of feminist critics who say that the two daughters do that because he's patriarchal. Of course, he's a patriarch. This is written written about 400 years ago and set in an even earlier period. Of course, he's a king, so he's used to having his authority. But that doesn't mean that justifies the treatment the way these girls are treating him. But there are feminists, not all feminist critics, not all. I don't want to say everybody's doing this, but several feminist critics who say that these girls are rebels against patriarchy. So they are some sort of early feminists who are rebelling against patriarchy. One of them actually blinds an old man. She and her husband actually blind him. Is this a rebellion against patriarchy? So not only that, then other critics actually imagine that the father must have sexually abused the daughters, for which they find something in there which they imagine. Nobody in the text says that. If Shakespeare wanted them to say that, he could easily put a speech into their mouths where they say that. But they don't. And it's not as if it could not have been said at that time, because other playwrights at the time were writing, and Shakespeare himself in other plays were writing about incest and father-daughter, all of this. So it's not like it was not talked about. But it's nowhere there. It's not in the text. Nobody ever refers to it. But because the father curses the daughter and says, may you never have a child, and when she is mistreating him, and so on, or if you have a child, let the child be ungrateful to you. So they say that his excessive anger shows that, and his use of these reference to her sexuality by saying, may you never have a child, this shows that there must have been sexual. No, it doesn't show any such thing, that there must have been sexual abuse, and that is what she is, that's why these daughters are behaving the way they are. Then why is the third daughter not doing that? So the explanation for that is, the third daughter is like a submissive wife. She leaves her husband in France. She's married in France, and she comes to look after her father, and she dies with her father, so she must be okay with this rape or whatever it is. All of this is imagined and imposed on the text. It's one of the worst examples. There are many lesser ones too, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So there can be a lot of ambiguity, when you're reading older texts. So when there is a text which doesn't quite settle into a single meaning, what makes you stay with the uncertainty rather than resolve it?
There's a famous book by William Empson called 7 Types of Ambiguity, right? And yeah, a lot of literature, but especially poetry, fiction less so, but depends on ambiguity. Like the end of Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. It says there was a very straight road, but we don't know what that means and where she's planning to go. Is she planning to go back to her husband, or does she have some other idea in mind? We don't know. Is she planning suicide? It's open-ended. So there is ambiguity like that, and then we have to stay with that ambiguity because we don't know. We can't write the ending to a novel. You can write a different novel with that about that, which many people do with that ending. But as far as the novel itself is concerned, the ending is ambiguous. So you have no choice but to live with that ambiguity. And what is the writer trying to suggest? Suggesting that there are different options open to her, and what she does, we don't know. And often, also in fiction, very often, we don't know all the motives of a person, or we know some of the motives, but as in real life, we know some of the motives, but you can never be absolutely sure which motives were more important. If there were several motives, which one was more important, and that could change over time too, right? At one time, the person's motive may be A, the most important motive, and after even 15 minutes, another motive could come into being. And a lot of writers have talked about this, the way in which the mind is fluid, and our ideas, our motives, etc., change from moment to moment, even certainly from year to year, decade to decade, and so on. So that's the ambiguity of life, which we also find in literature. Right?
Yeah. So as you say that we have to stay with the ambiguity, but what do we risk overlooking if we push a text toward a single text or meaning?
Right, it can only be done, and many critics do this. Many critics who are using all these types of theories do this. That can only be done by ignoring a lot of what the text says. You select what suits your theory and only focus on that while ignoring everything else that the text is saying. For example, to say that all ancient, there are so many critics. I wrote a book on the epics, on the Ramayana and Mahabharata, who will say, oh, they are patriarchal, they are totally, some will even say misogynist, they are anti-women, they are, that all they're saying is that a woman should be a good wife and mother, like say Gandhari or somebody. You have to overlook a lot. You select what suits your theory, but you have to overlook a lot. You overlook, for example, the many single women characters in the text. One of Sulabha is one I wrote about, but there are others. Shabari is another in Ramayana. There are many single women characters who are very well respected and who, yes, they do. In the case of Sulabha, she does get into a debate in which the king is prejudiced against her, but she points out his prejudices very, very well, and she wins the debate with him. So the text is presenting you with this character. So you have to overlook, and there are debates about this as well in the text. Various characters debate with each other on every possible issue, from women to vegetarianism to remarkably modern sounding debates. And you have to overlook a lot of that debate to pretend that the text has a fixed meaning and a fixed conclusion on many issues. It doesn't. See, on vegetarianism in the Mahabharata, there are many characters taking very many positions, different extreme positions and in-between positions, and there's no absolute conclusion. Different characters have different views and different conclusions about it. Now, if you want to pretend that no, there is only one thing that the text is saying, then you are reducing the complexity of the text to a simplistic meaning.
Yeah. There must be moments, of course there are moments when in translation, when there are two equally valid meanings, you have to choose between them. What guides that choice?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. You have to try your best to convey the emotion without departing completely from what the original is saying. You can't just, I don't like to just make up my own meaning. So for instance, in this poem I translated by song by Sant Ravidas, Ab kaise chute Ramanam rat lage, right? Ab kaise chute Ramanam rat lage. Rat lage, there is no English equivalent. Memorized, and rat today, that Rat Lagana has unfortunately become treated as a negative thing. Rat Lagana is a bad kind of learning. I don't agree, but this is what most people have turned Rat Lagana into. So if I say I've memorized Ram's name, that neither sounds poetic nor does it convey what the text is saying, which is that Ram's name has become so inherent in me that it cannot leave me. That's the idea. So I made it Rama's name in my heart and on my tongue. Ratalage means it's there in me and it is also just there on my tongue. Is that whole idea of repeating the name of God. That is what one is supposed to, one does. And so that's what I did. Or say something, Sona lage suhaga. Suhaga is borax, which is used to make the gold shine. Now, it's very unpoetic, gold and borax, but you can't Sona lage suhaga. There's an alliteration there with the sir and sir, and suhaga means borax, but it also has the meaning of suhag, and where a lot of gold is a part of marriage, right? You can't convey that double meaning in English, so I couldn't do that. So I had to just say, you are the gold, you are the pearl, I'm the thread, borax making gold shine bright. So I had to say that borax makes the gold. I couldn't bring in the other meaning of suhaga, and I also couldn't get that alliteration between borax and gold. you can't do it. There is no alliteration in English possible. So you can only do the best that you can. Yeah. Right. And if I was translating prose, poetry should not be overburdened with a whole lot of footnotes. But in prose, of course, I would give a footnote and explain, which I did. The same poem in my epics book, when I quoted it, I gave a footnote where I explained the play on the word sohag, many things about the whole poem. Or even Chakora and Chand, the moonbird gazing. I made it moonbird gazing at the moon. I didn't want to say partridge for the chakor, which loses the entire meaning. And chakor doesn't have that meaning in English of the bird that is staring at the moon. So I said moonbird to bring a little bit of it in. And when I'm analyzing the poem, if I'm analyzing it in prose, then I would put a footnote explaining the Chakora Chand connection. But when I'm just translating the poem as a poem in my book of poems, this is a book of poems, my poems and of translations, then I can't start putting so many footnotes in. So yeah, these are the best you can do, right?
How do you negotiate tone in translation, especially when even a slight shift in phrasing can change the way a character or a relationship is perceived?
Well, I can only speak for myself here as a translator. In Indian aesthetic theory, the idea is that the author, the reader, should be sahridaya, of the same heart, sharing the same emotions with the poet. And the poem is good if it manages to make that happen, to make the reader feel what the poet was feeling. And I think a translator also has to be the same, sahridaya. You have to I have to get myself into the same state of emotion that the poet was in. And this poem that I just quoted to you, it's a state of devotion. In the case of this other poem, wo jo hum mein tum mein karar tha, tumhe yaad ho ke na yaad ho, that ghazal which I translated, there it is getting into that state of a love that you remember, a love affair that you remember, and that's easy for anyone to do. You get into that. So what once there was between you and me, you may recall or not recall. That commitment to continuity, you may recall or not recall. I'm quite happy with this translation because I managed to keep the ghazal rhyme and meter, and also to keep the radif, the words that occur at the end of each line. I used recall, not remember, to keep that vowel, yaad, that long vowel. So yeah, and I hope that it conveys that sort of nostalgic emotion that the original has, and I kept the internal rhyme as well. I'm the one you thought loyal and true, the one who once was dear to you. The same sad moment I used to be, whether you recall or do not recall. So I try to keep that plangent kind of rhythm that is in the original. Yeah.
Have you ever felt that translating a text made you agree with it even less, or maybe understand it less comfortably than when you first read it?
I only I could, for instance, we were talking about post-colonial theory, and I've written a little bit about it, one essay, but I could easily write a book critiquing it and tearing it apart. But I have decided not to focus, whether in translation or in criticism, not to focus on texts that I don't agree with and don't like, because I don't want to be in a negative state of mind, and being. I want to write about and translate texts that I love. Otherwise, I want Ananda to be the product. I want joy to be the effect on me as well as the product for the reader and myself. So therefore, I don't translate texts I don't agree with. So I'm translating Mahadevi Verma now. I've translated 2 of her books. One is My Family, Mera Parivar. Penguin published this, and this is about her animal companions, all her rescued animals, like a deer and a squirrel and a very interesting animals, a rabbit and a peacock, or 3 peacocks. And she calls them her family. She was a single woman, and she had this huge household of people and animals. So that was one I translated. Then I translated just now this year the book called Portraits from Memory, which is her sketches of people, mostly low-income people, whom she knew throughout her life, HarperCollins brought this one out, and now I'm translating Path Ke Saathi, which is about other poets like Nirala, Tagore, etc., poets she knew, and it's a little book about these poets. So yes, I learn a lot from these translations, like from translating the one I'm doing now. I didn't know so much about the lives of Sumitranandan Pant or Nirala, about their personalities, but she knew them all personally, and so it brings them out, and Tagore too. I learn a lot from them. Does it make me agree less with them? I don't agree with everything she says, all her views. She was a Gandhian. I agree with some of it and not all of it, certainly, all her views. But that's okay. One doesn't have to agree with everything, you know. I mean, overall, there should be. I admire her work and I love her wonderful prose style. But yeah, one doesn't have to agree with everything. One can't agree with the opinions, all the opinions of anyone, living or dead. No?
Of course, of course. Yeah. So across centuries of literature, what strikes you as unchanged in how people experience relationships?
What's unchanged is what the rasas say, those 9 emotions which are felt by everyone, everywhere at different times in different mixtures and combinations. And the everyday experience, just the everyday experience. There's a funny line in Shakespeare, which is very well observed. It's a prose line where one man says to another, I'm carrying the inventory of your shirts in my head, like this one and the other one you have for formal wear. So this, I'm summing up, this is not Shakespeare's language, but then it just struck me, wow, this is absolutely true. Wherever you are, your close friends and associates, you know all their clothes. It's all in your head. And when they wear it, you say, well, I know this one and there's that. You know. Now, this is not something you consciously try to remember, that, but you are carrying that inventory. Now, this is the sharpness of observation, to have noticed a universal experience. You know, this is a very small experience. But if you want to take major experiences like, say, jealousy, when Othello is so got this fixated on his nonsensical and imagined infidelity of his wife. And in real life, when I worked for Manushi, this women's organization that I co-founded, for 13 years I worked on, and just in everyday life, in friends' lives too, I see that to be absolutely true. There are people who just fixate on the idea that the other person is being unfaithful. And they have shreds of evidence that are not evidence at all, that they have just decided are evidence. And you can't shake that idée fixée in their head. Nobody can, and Emilia in Othello says, jealous, you can't give them logic and reason, because jealous men will not be answered so. They are jealous for they are jealous. They just are jealous. You can't give them reasons and say, no, this was not true, this was not what happened. They are not going to be, because that they just are jealous. So he notices the nature of jealousy, which is, again, pretty cross-cultural across time and place. Yeah.
Yeah. You just talked about details, ordinary details, like, remembering your friend's clothes. And do you think that literature has always paid more attention to the ordinary than we credit it for?
Absolutely. My book on Urdu poetry, it's called Gender, Sex and the City, is all about this. And it's about, instead of being about Urdu poetry, the kind of Urdu poetry we are used to, the ghazals, which are all about love and pining for love and all. This poetry that I analyze in this book is everyday poetry about women's everyday lives. From the 18th century, I'm talking about 18th and early 19th century. Women's going for shopping, going for picnics, going for excursions, buying jewelry, buying cosmetics, buying clothing, chatting with their neighbors, fighting with their friends, all of this with their servants, whatever. And I wrote this, since most people don't read academic books, and I also wrote this novel, Memory of Light, which is based on that poetry, and even quotes and translates some of that poetry. And it's about two women's relationship with each other, love relation, romance with each other. And in it, there are also other people. There's a man and woman also having a romance, also based on the poetry of the time. I also translated this book into Hindi as Pariyon Ke Beech, and that was a very interesting translation exercise. The only one I've done from English to Hindi. Otherwise, my translations have been Hindi to English. And I love this poetry because, I love the other kind of love ghazal too, which I just read to you, the Momin ghazal, which is about love. But I also love this type of poetry, which gives you which is about everyday life, some of which is different from today, and some of which is remarkably the same as today. When I read some of this poetry out into audiences, they are shocked that it was 2 centuries ago. It sounds to them like it's written today. The Urdu, which was called Hindi at the time, Hindi means the language of Hind as opposed to Farsi, the language of Persia. It's everyday language that anybody can understand right now. Here's an example. जो सोचा खूब सा मैंने उनकी दोस्ती का ढब. Okay, जो सोचा खूब सा मैंने उनकी दोस्ती का ढब. I thought a lot about the nature of this friendship, right? Of this friendship with the other person. Unki. Now this you can't do in English because unki can be his or her. We don't know. उनकी दोस्ती का ढब ना सीधा है, ना टेढ़ा है, ना आड़ा है, ना तिरछा है. ना तिरछा है, ना आड़ा है. The nature of this friendship is such that it is neither straight nor crooked nor bent nor whatever. So this is an experience we've all had when we're thinking about a particular friendship or relationship. What exactly is it? It's ambiguous. Is it straightforward? No, it's kind of crooked. What is it? This person, the woman, it's a woman speaker. The poet is male, but the speaker in this poetry is always a woman. It's called Rekhti poetry. So she's thinking about the friendship she has with somebody and what is going on in this, what is the nature of this friendship. Now, so it's about right, so it's about this is an experience, universal experience in a way.
So is the modern reader more drawn towards conflict and rupture and therefore missing out on the smaller, the subtler continuities in text?
Yes, there's always conflict in literature. If there's no conflict, then there's no story, right? There's always conflict in literature, some sort of conflict. But I think modern sort of critical theory and modern ideologies have taught us to look to impose on the text conflicts which may not be in the text at all, say class conflicts or whatever conflict, gender conflicts, etc., which may not be there. And this poetry, Rekhti poetry, is all about women's everyday lives and love relationships, mostly with other women. Women spend most of their times with women in those days, and even today I would say you spend a lot of time with your own sex. And so it's not about all the victimhood of being an oppressed wife or mother. Then the wifehood and motherhood is just not talked about at all. They are mothers and there's some mention of it, but it's not the main focus at all. The poet has decided, the many poets have decided to look at it from a different angle, and that's what I tried to do in this novel of mine, A Slight Angle, where it's a quotation, a slight angle, where you looking at life from a slightly different angle. The focus doesn't have to be only, it will be on love, romantic love, but not only on that. It can also be on friendships. It can be on sibling relationships. It can be like several of Jane Austen's novels are, like Sense and Sensibility, right? So the most important relationship in your life may not be with a husband or a wife or a partner. It could be with your mother. It could be with your sister. It could be with your friend. It could be, could be with your dog. So this poetry, the Rekhti poetry I'm talking about, and a lot of poetry in all languages, is about all these different types of relationships and different types of experiences and events, many of which are conflicted, but not the kinds of conflicts that we might expect. It's not necessarily gender conflict. It could be, as in Othello, but it's not necessarily that. It's not necessarily class conflict or race conflict or something like that. It could be some totally different type of conflict that everybody, and then it may not be primarily conflicted even, right? So you have to, I would say, my approach is to trust the text and follow, suspend, as Coleridge says, suspend disbelief. The first time you're reading a text, and I always tell my students this, the first time you're reading a novel or a poem, if you go in with the attitude that you want to destroy it and show how clever you are, by you are somehow cleverer than Jane Austen, or that, because you will show how she is classist or how she's middle class or whatever, you won't enjoy the novel at all, and it doesn't matter to the novel. The novel is going to last regardless of you. It is going to matter to you. You're not going to have the pleasure, and you're not going to learn from it. The first time you read it, I think the best way is to suspend disbelief and go with the writer, where the writer is taking you into their world and into their way of looking at things. And then later rereadings, you can be critical and take different views of it and so on. Um, but yes, to bring a standard from outside, an ideological standard, whether that standard is Christianity or whether it's Marxism or whatever it is, and try to bash any writer who doesn't fit that that framework or force them into that framework, is, I think, a mistake. As I said, it doesn't matter to the work. The work will survive without you, but it matters for you. Yeah.
I have read your Slight Angle, so I know exactly where you're coming from, and the relationships which are not projected as important, but they are on the sides, but they are as important. What is the it makes me just curious to ask you this. What is the literary value of uneventful lives, of relationships that don't outright present themselves as extraordinary?
Well, I can give the example of male-female friendships, which are very often for past texts are overlooked, because we think, and rightly, that most relationships in the past were between men or between friendships. I'm talking about friendships, not love relationships. So that love relationships were between men and women, but friendships were between men and between women. That's true. But there were also male-female friendships, and that's what in both my novels, I have talked about male-female friendships of different unexpected kinds. Like in A Slight Angle, there is a Hindu girl who marries a Christian man against the opposition of both families. Now in many novels, this would become the central relationship, and all the other things would revolve around it. But here it isn't. It is there, and I've got 6 narrators, so 2 of the narrators are this couple. But there's another friendship develops between her brother and his sister, who are very unusual people in themselves. The sister is a Gandhian activist, and the brother is a guy who's trying to do something different in his profession, not go into his father's profession, but do something. It's set in the 1920s. So this is an unusual thing he's trying to do. He's also in love with a man, and they form a friendship which becomes an underlying running theme throughout the novel, right? So there are the romances in the novel, there are other kinds of things, but this friendship is, I think, is very important, and how she gradually, she's one of the narrators, Sheila is her name, she gradually discovers things about him, about Sharad, that she didn't know, that he's in love with a man. She never figured it out. And she was wondering if he could marry her friend who kind of likes him. And then there's a moment at which he doesn't say it, but she sees it in the eyes of the guy whom he's in love with, and suddenly it's a flash, it's a revelation to her. But the friendship between these two is very helpful to both of them, because they can discuss with each other things that they cannot discuss with their siblings or parents or even their everyday their other friends, their same-sex friends. They can't discuss. They discuss with each other. So that's what. And in the other novel, Memory of Light, also, which is set in 18th century Lucknow, also there are these friendships between courtesans, the wives who are in the kota, and men who visit the kota, who are regular visitors, some of whom are minor characters, are actual poets from the time, real life poets of. And this is true. It's based on the prose of that time, where these poets say that they learnt their language from a lot of their idioms and language from the women they knew, women friends. So we think that men went to kotas only to have love affairs. They did that as well, of course, or to have sex, but also they were friendships, they were conversations there. It was a place where men could go and relax in the company of women, and have, these women were very highly educated and accomplished women, that the wives were not sex workers, they were highly educated women, and they could talk about literature, about life, about love, in a way these men could talk freely with them, in a way they could not talk with the women of their families, who were the only women whom they would otherwise meet. So even with their wives, they couldn't, right? So, but with these women, they could have these conversations, and you see that in the poetry, and that's what I tried to bring out in the novel as well. Yeah.
You've moved from criticism to fiction and to poetry. When you move from, let's say, criticism and to fiction or poetry, does your relationship with language change?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because in criticism, it's discursive prose. You're trying to write I try to write in a very clear and lucid way that anyone who knows the language well can understand it fairly well. You don't have to be an academic to understand people might get intimidated or scared of academic books, but my nonfiction is written for the general reader. I want everybody to be, even an undergraduate, to be able to understand it. So I write in that way. I don't use jargon. I don't use any in terms that people won't understand. I don't use any of that. So there's that. But I'm trying to explain a point or make an argument. In a novel, that's not what you're trying to do, right? And so in a novel, I'm telling a story or a set of stories, and the language is also figurative. It's not just discursive, it's not just describing something or certainly not arguing anything. But it is, there's no argument in that sense, but it is trying to create a mood, a setting, an atmosphere, set of characters. It is figurative language, and that's even more heightened than poetry. And poetry, the language is largely figurative, right? It's not I mean, there is the kind of poetry which is the poetry of statement, but it's suggestive. The language in poetry is suggestive, where you are suggesting something that you are not exactly saying or stating, and the reader has to pick up on the suggestion, right? That's how the language of poetry is different from the language of prose of any kind, right? And also the reader, and this is true of most poetry, the reader has to guess where you're going with this. Even in a short poem, it's not clear at the start. Whereas in a book where you're making an argument, you state it at the start. You state your main argument at the start and then unpack it. In a poem, it's kind of the opposite very often, where you kind of, like for instance in this poem, it's called Saris. Your birthday tomorrow, I must go sari shopping. Now who the you is, you don't know. So that could be, and this happens in fiction too, so this could be anyone, any woman, right? And then goes on to describe, and then says, I leave the tiny flat where we live, the four of us. Now who are the four of us? Is it me and a spouse and children? But it actually isn't. And then at a CP corner, two shops face each other. One is clothing. Amid reds, mustards, magentas, I look for the pastels you like, saris draped over my lap. Cold. Is my mother alive? I think, half awake, calculate. Is it May? No, it's not. And now I'm chilled through. So I don't say that my mother is dead, but I say, is my mother alive? And then I say, I think, is it May? Now what does that mean? It means that her birthday was in May. But for you, the reader, have to perhaps read twice to figure that out. And now I'm chilled through. Half awake means that I'm waking up from the dream in which I was buying these saris, which you wouldn't know when you read from the start that it is a dream at all, right? So you probably have to read this twice, and you get to the end, you realize that, okay, it was a dream, the mother is dead, and I was dreaming of her birthday, which is in May, and of buying her a sari. But it's not, none of this is stated anywhere. You have to sort of gather that by the end. Okay?
So is there anything, are there things you would only ever say in a poem and never in an essay?
Yes, in an essay, a poem, very often a poem is autobiographical, or semi-autobiographical, and critical essay is usually not, unless it's a memoir, right? So yes, I wouldn't write about my love relationships in a critical essay, certainly not in detail. I might mention in passing if it was a memoir, but not in anything, not anywhere else. And in the poem, it dwells on emotion. It's not just telling a story of an actual relationship. It dwells on emotion, right? And that emotion, like in this poem, little I call you, too much you hold me, little I know you, little you've told me. Raising your eyes, you pour sadness through me, sand seeping slowly, hours to undo me. Two worlds transparent, slender their meeting, cup running over, reticence reaching. Emptied to fullness, endless this measure, sleepless I write you, invert a beginning. Now the emotion and the language, you can't say it in prose. You can, and this is true of any poem. And I try to sum up, say, the Ode to a Nightingale or a Ghalib Ghazal or something. It's very hard to translate into English. But if you were, even in the original language, you try to explain the meaning of it to the students, you can get something through. But only the poem can say what the poem is saying. You know, you can't. You can't explain it away by putting it into prose, because prose can't say what is being said through the poem. Yeah.
Has the way you read changed over the years? Have you become more patient or more questioning?
I have my way of reading certain things. Media, for example, history, for example, has changed. As earlier, when you're young, you're just a passive recipient, and you take everything that is in print to be true. And it takes some time to realize. Like, for example, I used to read the New York Times every morning for many years, and there was a point at which I started noticing that everything they wrote about India and about Hinduism was negative, almost everything, 95%. And I became so irritated by it. After a while, I stopped reading what they wrote about India. And then it occurred to me that if this is what they're doing with India, why would they be doing anything different with everything else? And now once you get that angle, you start now noticing so many gaps, missing things, selective kind of reporting, and on many things, both on America and also on outside other countries. I just stopped reading the New York Times altogether. And you realize that I realized that you have to look at different sources and different newspapers. You can't just read one that takes one angle. If you just read only the New York Times and listen to the NPR, which are very left-leaning vehicles, both of them, and lots of people do just that. They just watch CNN, listen to NPR, and read the New York Times. You get only one view of situations. If you read those and you also read something else, say the Wall Street Journal, something else, then you get a somewhat corrected view, you get a view from the other side, and then you can make up your mind, right? That's the way one should read. And same thing with history, that there's a lot of biases built in to history writing, and it takes you time to realize that. You don't when you're a student, right? So, yeah.
Is there a risk of reading literature too programmatically today, looking for confirmation rather than surprise?
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier when talking about theory, that if you start out with a formula, if you start out, let's say, with anything, with Marxism, with Christianity, with feminism, or a certain kind of feminism is a very broad term, but you start out with a certain kind of feminist theory or queer theory, and you think that's the truth somehow, that you got hold of the truth with your ideology, post-colonial theory, anything it could be, and then you start reading every text to see whether it either confirms what you think or it goes against what you think. So if it confirms what you think it confirms what you think, it might not, then you like it. And if it doesn't confirm what you think, then you bash it. And sometimes you're not sure what the text is, where exactly to fit it, then you make it fit into your formula. Right, so then as you said, you lose surprise and you lose wonder. You lose wonder, and wonder is one of the most enjoyable experiences with art, any art, not just literature, but visual art too. And if you lose wonder, adbhuta rasa, then you lose a lot, and you're not also getting what the text may be telling you or showing you. For example, one of my favorite poems is Andrew Marvell's Had We But Whirled Enough in Time. It's one of the greatest poems, I think, in English. Where he's telling it's a very old theme. He didn't invent the theme, but he's doing something really funny and playful with it. So it's an old theme, which is seize the day, seize the hour. It comes from ancient Greece and Rome, like enjoy yourself now, right? Because you will lose your youth and your ability to enjoy. So that's what it is. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. Though she doesn't want to have sex with him and his beloved. And he says, yeah, you will grow old and then you'll be dead and you'll be in the grave. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do their embrace. So that's the funny, witty part of it. He's showing his wit, and it's just brilliantly done. But some of my students who had come straight from women's studies classes and feminist theory said that he is trying to force her to have sex with him. They don't know the difference between persuasion and force, between seduction and rape. And I asked them, is there no difference between seduction and rape? And they said they seem to think no, that if you're trying to persuade somebody to be with you, to have sex with you, then that's equal to rape. Which an adult, I'm talking about adults, which is, I think, absurd. If you never make a move to anyone in advance to anyone, then how are you ever going to know if they're interested? If both parties just cannot persuade, cannot make any move, then you'll be forever in this limbo. So, and they also completely miss the wittiness, the playfulness, all of that in the poem, because they're just looking for meaning. See, this is when you're not looking for wit or for playfulness or for anything, but you're just looking for meaning. What is the meaning? What is he saying? Oh, he's trying to get her to have sex with him. That's a bad thing. Therefore, I don't like the poem. The poem must be patriarchal and misogynist. So also, of course, they didn't know the whole history of the carpet, because these days the way English is, or literature is taught, English literature particularly is the only one I can speak for, they are not given history and chronology of English literature, right? So they are taught one bit of literature from the 16th century, one bit of Japanese literature from the 20th century, one bit of Urdu literature from the 19th century. No connection between any of these, no history of any of these languages or literatures. They are swimming in this vacuum. So they didn't know that there is a whole tradition of poets going back to the Greeks and the Romans who are talking about, who have this theme of enjoy yourself here and now, gather you roses while you may, kind of enjoy yourself now. So he didn't make up this poem. So they're assuming that Andrew Marvell, the poet, is an actual man who is actually trying to persuade an actual woman to have sex with him. No, it's not. It's a poem on this theme of seize the day, seize the hour, enjoy yourself. It's a poem. He may not have had an affair at all. It may not be about his life at all. It's about an imagined love relationship. And the question being, should you have sex now or should you keep waiting and waiting? So, you know, that's what it is. And the funniest thing to me was these were American students who are freely having sex, who don't believe that they should wait for sex till marriage. That's not what they believe. But when it comes to the poem, they revert to the most puritanical values. It's most interesting. It's wonderful.
So we do underestimate the intelligence of older texts by in a bit to explain it too quickly. We do.
Absolutely. It's this view that every day and everywhere things are getting better and better. No, they're not. And when I taught Sappho, for example, the ancient Greek poet writing about love relationships with women, I said, you know, things haven't got better since her time. In her time, there's no protest. She's writing these poems, but she's not protesting about anything. She's not finding it anything strange. None of the people around her are finding it anything strange. She's just writing about love. Never again in the next 2,000 years could you write, not 2,000 years, you could for some years after that, but then in the modern period, you couldn't do this. You had to be hiding it, you had to be changing pronouns, you had to be, doing all kinds of things. You couldn't write openly and cheerfully about this kind of love anymore. So things are not getting better in some ways they're getting better, in some ways they're getting worse, and in some way, who knows, they're going in some different directions. We don't know, right? So to imagine that we know everything, we are smarter than Kalidas or than Tulsidas, and that we can tell them whether we can judge whether they were patriarchal, heterosexist, this, that, or the other, because we are so smart and we have all these words and they didn't, is to, as you said, seriously to underestimate the intelligence of the past, of people in the past. Also, you have all this new American formula, 20th century American formula of we have to make the world a better place. I have to make myself a better person. I have to constantly make myself a better person, and I have to make the world a better place. So you have these 18-year-olds who are setting out to go on these foreign trips to Guatemala or to India or wherever to make things better there. As if those people there, even if they are illiterate, they are people with experience, life experience. Somebody in their 50s has life experience. You are going to go and tell him or her how to make their village better? No, that's not how those people are laughing at you to your face. But, they want to get whatever money or whatever you can give since you've come from a richer country, but they don't think that you as an 18-year-old know more than they do. So this idea that our purpose in life is to make the world a better place, which is basically a Christian idea recycled in Marxism, is, I think, a huge obstacle to understanding the world, to making yourself the recipient to first understand the world and understand life before trying to sort of bludgeon it into doing what you think is the best thing to be done. Yeah.
After a lifetime of reading and writing, what continues to surprise you about literature?
As I said, I keep discovering insight into everyday experience. Like I gave you the example of jealousy in Othello, but then I was reading a minor Victorian novelist, George Gissing, and there's this novel about an older man who falls in love with a younger woman, and the same sort of jealousy, but he knows that he wants her to only spend all her time only with him and not with anyone else, not with her friends or her mother, or go to concerts or go to anything. It's the 19th century. And he says, why do you need anybody else? If you love me, I love you, I don't need anybody else than you. He kneels down and he says, I adore you, and if you love me, you won't need anybody else. You should be happy just with me. Why do you want to go out to dinner or invite anyone or anything? And so there's a certain kind of idea of love which still today, and why I notice this is because this happens to people that I know, where the spouse kind of tries to make them feel that they should, if you really love me, you should just want to spend all your time with me. Why do you want to meet your friends and why do you want to spend much time with them? Okay, meet them, but briefly and just with me, and you shouldn't want to meet them alone, for example. So this we may think is now in modern world would not be there, but it's very much there. And it's a brilliant little portrait of it in this 19th century now. So one thing that surprises me is that kind of insight. And another thing that surprises me, with surprised by joy, as Wordsworth said, is just the lovely language. Like, I'm translating Mahadevi Verma, and just the beautiful language she's writing. This is not one of her best pieces even. She's writing an essay, eulogy for Rabindranath Tagore, who had just died. And just the language she uses her language is so beautiful, and there's so much depth and profundity to her language of describing things, and she plays on words in a way. The word has more than one meaning, and she plays on the word. She uses these words like sadhana, sadhaka, not in a religious context, but for an artist, for a writer, for a potter, for an ordinary potter whom she meets, a very poor potter, but he has sadhana in him. This is one that I translated in this book, Portraits from Memory. And he's a very bad potter to begin with. He makes these ugly, misshapen vessels, and he says, no, this is the way we do it in my village. But then she just gives him a picture of Saraswati, just as a decoration for his hut. And he is so inspired by that picture that he starts wanting to make an image of Saraswati that should be beautiful, as in the picture. And he works on it again and again and again, keeps breaking them when he makes them and making new. And finally makes a fantastically beautiful one, which he comes and brings to her at Diwali. And this is sadhana, that has inspired him to, and after that he starts making beautiful things. So that's just a minor example, but this is how she takes words and uses them in different contexts to mean a variety of things that cannot be expressed. Sadhana, there's no English equivalent for this. No? So, yeah.
And talking of that, what keeps you returning to certain texts? Is it curiosity or pleasure, or is it something else?
It's pleasure, basically. I read a lot for pleasure, and reread a lot for pleasure, and read new things also for pleasure. If I like a particular poet, then I like very few modern poets, but present-day poets. But if I like a particular poet or writer, I like Suniti Ram Joshi, I like Vikram Seth, then anything they publish, I'll buy it and read it, which doesn't mean that I like all their work equally. Like, I love Vikram Seth's poetry, but then I read his Hanuman Chalisa translation, I didn't like it at all, and that's not perhaps his fault. Hanuman Chalisa cannot be translated into English, so you can't keep that rhythm. He tries to keep the rhythm and the rhyme, but then if you keep that, you lose a lot. You can't keep the meanings of the words. So it's pleasure that keeps me, and then going back to certain authors, like reading Jane Austen over again, or reading Nirala over again. This is pleasure, just because I like listening to Hindi film songs. A lot of them are older ones. A lot of them are great poets. They were written by great poets. The words are, and so it's for the pleasure that one goes back.